Week 9 explores the history of social movements, focusing on labor history and organizing strategies with Tzazná Miranda Leal.
So I took this down for a second just so we could maybe do some intros. It will help me. Actually, can I borrow one of your pens? I'm Tzazná. I've mostly worked in organizing with people that were doing farm work, but also caregiving, so taking care of children, the elderly. I worked with people that have been truck drivers, service workers. Right now I'm working with LCBO workers. They're members of the union where I work, OPSEU. And I wanted to talk to you a bit about workers' rights, unions, and how we do organizing. The reason I keep in my bio the fact that I got a tenant organization together in my building where I used to rent is that the principles of organizing in your workplace are similar to those that you would use organizing in your building and in your neighborhood and in your church and in your temples and mosques and in your community organizations as well. So I find them to be something that you can learn and use in multiple spaces, and so we'll talk more about that. But I was hoping to hear from you if you're working right now, where you work, what kind of work you do, and how big your workplace is, so how many people you're working with. And if you're not working right now, then maybe your last job, if that works. Do you want to start this way? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of you have unions. Some of you may not. Some of you hate your unions. Some of you might not know that you're unionized. That's all very common. Most of us haven't really had a unionized job for a lot of our careers and a lot of our lives, right? It's, I think, more common than not. So, okay, amazing. Thank you. I learned a lot. I have so many questions about so many of your employers, like Walmart and Dollarama. I want to know what they're like, but so the reason I was asking you is that I thought we could maybe use one of your workplaces as an example to talk about some of the things that we're going to discuss today. So we'll use the board for that. I was hoping for a workplace that was small enough that we could maybe talk about who works there. Okay, so we'll get into, I wanted to talk to everybody about forming a union because, I mean, it's interesting for me that many of you are unionized and have been unionized. That's not always the case. More and more these days, jobs are not unionized, especially in retail, in service, a lot of the times in admin as well. But it can be one way of pushing and fighting for your rights. It's not the ultimate way, and it's not something that solves all of your problems. Unions are human organizations, and as such, they have issues, right? But it can be one very powerful tool that people can push for rights, like when they're injured, they should be able to keep their jobs, right? So who can tell me what a union is? I know we have some stewards here, some union members, some proud union members. So what is a union? As a union staff, I can tell you, union staff is often a very small part of an organization, and the largest part of the organization is every one of you. The most powerful unions are the workplaces where all of the workers are talking to each other, because the union is in fact you. Yeah, so like I said, unions are human organizations that are flawed like every other organization, and there will be issues with representation always. But the way to become the strongest union is for all of you to be talking to each other, working with each other, so that you make sure that you're representing coworkers, but also your staff are attending to those needs, right? Most unions have language that they've negotiated for that say, oh, every new member, every new person who joins the staff has the right to go and, take a training for 20 minutes with their union steward. But the reality is you rarely see that happen. And us, ourselves in our workplace, we rarely enforce it as well. So there's two parts. Like, as a union, you can be part of your bargaining team and you can negotiate really key, really important things, but then you need to enforce it. And the enforcement is the most the most important, but also the most difficult. Because you've gotten the employer to commit to like, yes, everybody's gonna do this, and yes, everybody's gonna be protected when certain things happen. But because we're not organized in our workplaces, we're not able to then put all of those things in motion so that you can get the right representation, so that every new member is getting an orientation, so that everybody understands that they're going into bargaining and they know, oh, this is my bargaining team member. I know that I can go to her with concerns and she's gonna put them at the table. And so we're gonna talk about how the process of unionizing, initially, a new workplace often leads to a workplace that's really well organized, but over the years that falls apart. In every union that exists, we let it fall apart, and only a workplace that's constantly talking to each other can push their elected leaders and their staff to do the things that they need, right? Because when we assume that someone's gonna take care of that out of their own will, often doesn't happen, right? You need to be on that as a group together, right? So we'll talk a bit about that. I'm trying to say a union is an organization of you and your colleagues. You pool your energy to push your employer on something. For example, when you negotiate your new agreement, you select a team, you trust your team with negotiations, then you all back up your team. You're pooling your resources to push for what you want. That is what unions are. And like every social project that we've all been a part of, we know that sometimes things fall apart, that people sometimes don't do what they said they were gonna do, right? And unions are the same as every other organization that you've been a part of. If people aren't regularly in constant contact with each other, these things fall apart. And the unions that are the strongest, that get the strongest agreements, that get the best enforcement of the things that their bargaining team fights for, are the ones where everybody's talking to each other and in the workplace are helping out with the enforcement part. Because me, let's say I'm staff, I help people put together campaigns to push their employer on things. I don't know what's happening in Dollarama. I don't know what you see on the street when you go out as a community worker. I don't, but you do and your colleagues do. Right? So one of the things I do with all the members that I work with is say, okay, there's many issues, I'm sure. Every union has issues, some worse than others, but they all have issues. So how do we get this to a more functional place where everybody can get the protection that they need? For example, what happened to Connie is something that if all coworkers in her in her warehouse had known about, they all could have pulled together in a unionized environment and said, we need to call in our steward to file a grievance, and we need to start paperwork to make sure that, yes, this already happened, this, let's say, an injury, but we need to make sure it doesn't go any further. We need to make sure that Connie has her job waiting for her when she wants to come back, right? And unions like tenant organizations, like community organizations, we all get tired, people come in and out, there's always gonna be conflict, right? None of them are gonna be perfect. But you can use them for your protection if you all pull together to push for certain things, which is what happens every few years when they go into negotiating of the contract, right? So what a union is you pulling your resources, including your time as members, but also your money. People pay union dues so that they can pay for things like strike funds, right? So if you go on strike, for funds, right? A lot of unions have funds that you can apply for special circumstances, accidents, deaths in the family, things like that. You pay for staff you pay for a legal team to handle cases. You pay for a lot of different things like that. You pay for example, if you want to do union work, maybe your union takes you out of your workplace so that you can go out and talk to your coworkers, you would be paying out of those dues for your wages. Right? So you're pooling your resources, some of your union dues for that. And the big thing about a union versus a non-union workplace that some of you will know is you have a union contract, right? That's one of the biggest differences that you'll see is instead of everybody having a different contract, maybe people get paid at different amounts, you negotiate one contract for everybody where everybody's wages is set up there, when it comes time to renegotiate, your team goes and pushes for increases usually, right? You push for protection for people when they're injured, right? So it's usually a really long document, more than 100 pages, your union contract, if you've ever looked at it, right? I'm sure you know. The TDSB must be very long, where they lay out everything from discipline to wages to how to make complaints about your employer if they did something they shouldn't have. Those are all things that would be in your union contract. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So has anyone ever been a part of becoming unionized in Ontario? I know you've been a union member, but has anyone ever formed a union? So this is what I have up on the screen. I want to share these with everyone. Actually, do you want to help me pass them? These ones you can keep, but we're going to send the original file so you can have it. You may have enough. I printed them 2 per page, which was a mistake. It's very small, which is why I put it on the screen. And you'll all get a copy with a bigger font because this is way too small. So, thanks, Kayla. So, unions are regulated provincially, which means how unions function and how to unionize is different in every province. This is about Ontario. This is a resource made by Black Femme Legal right here in Toronto by really amazing activists and legal minds. So let's say that we're working with our colleague to unionize Dollarama. Our colleague comes to us and says, hey, this is not a great workplace. It needs to be unionized because somebody got injured and they were let go and we're not sure that they can come back and they didn't receive proper compensation. So we want to get organized so we can push for her to keep her job back or have her job back. And this already came up quite a bit. Step number 1 is to make sure that you can be represented by a union. So not everybody has the right in Ontario to be represented by a union. One good example of that is care workers. People who work taking care of children and the elderly, usually by themselves in a home, don't have the right to form unions in Ontario. They're excluded from that. Domestic workers is how they're excluded from those protections. Same as farm workers from forming unions. You would still be covered by WSIB for workplace accidents and injuries. And you would still be covered by Ontario law, but not by the right to form a union, which is really terrible. So many people are working in workplaces by themselves, taking care of the elderly, taking care of children. Same in the US. It's because Canada copied that from the US. Farm workers also can't. Managers or people who handle payroll also can't because they have access to confidential information. Your managers, the people who maybe hired you or fired you, those people cannot join unions in Ontario. Most other people can. If you're an independent contractor, you're not considered an employee, right? So you may not be able to unionize. So if you're doing one-off jobs, maybe painting houses, that kind of thing for, your neighbor, you can't form a union in Ontario. In different provinces, it's slightly different. PSWs can, because that's officially a different job than domestic work, which is very similar. It doesn't make sense, but you're not covered by the right to unionize. That's right. It doesn't mean you can't get together and negotiate with your employer, but you're not protected by the law in Ontario in order to do it, which is pretty much the same. It ends up being the same. And it's something that people have been excluded for many years. Many activists have called for the end to that exclusion and for people to have the right to unionize. But it's something that no government has rectified. What's the reason? They've never given a reason why. Well, actually, no. In agriculture, it's because of the agricultural lobby. It's because growers in Canada have so much power. Here with care workers, I think it was that families could barely afford to pay, that was the reason given, to pay people bringing it, coming in and doing care in their home. But, and so that it would be hard for families to still hire somebody. But the other problem for care workers is that they often have one worker in one employer, right? Yeah. And that's also something that, most unions have at least 2 workers, right? Or not most. Any union has at least 2 workers. So that's a huge fight because Uber says that Uber drivers and delivery people are not employees. They say that they are contractors. So that's an ongoing fight that, you're supposedly self-employed, even though...
But you're contracted to a company, right?
Supposedly. That's what Uber said, right? And that was a huge fight. Do you remember Foodora?
Yes.
So Foodora workers filed to unionize. It was a very long fight for them to be able to reach everybody to sign union cards and submit an application. And Foodora, instead of dealing with it, they left Canada. Yes. They shut down operations and there's no more Foodora. Right? And Uber is in the same fight. And in different provinces, it's in different stages of the fight. But it's the same thing. It's people saying, no, we are employees. We work, I go where you tell me in the speed that you tell me. And that makes me an employee. And so that's up for debate, right? And so many employees are misclassified. And you're told, no, you're a contractor. But in reality, you're an employee. And so sometimes working with a union to get unionized means defining first, am I an employee or am I a contractor? And sometimes it's part of the whole fight. The difference between an employee and a contractor is usually around independence and dependence of your employer, right? So contractors work supposedly on their own hours with their own equipment, right? Think about somebody who repairs kitchens. They work on their own hours, they have their own equipment. You have a whole amount that you've agreed to for the work, and you work whenever you can to get it done. You don't work on the hours or with the equipment of the employer, right? So there's usually there's supposed to be a distinction that makes sense. And many people are in a gray area. Uber, obviously, is getting away with saying that people are contractors. And they may be found to be employees. In fact, that's something that's happening. That's, with Foodora, they left the country rather than find out what was going to happen. But in the meantime, how many people have been working for years for Foodora or for Uber without the ability to unionize? And there's a Gig Workers United campaign to unionize Uber workers, and that's the fight that they have taken up, and they have it in the courts, is these people are not contractors, they're employees. So you have to first win that fight at the labor board and then go through the steps of a union. Yeah, does that make sense? So it seems simple, but first you have to make sure that you can be unionized when you want to become unionized. Not everybody can be unionized. And often you can call a union, speak to a union organizer, which is the person who works with people to become unionized. And they'll ask you all these questions like, okay, how are you paid? Let's make sure that you're actually an employee, right? What are your hours of work? Where do you work? Let's look at how you're set up. In places like Walmart and Dollarama, it's usually very simple. People have a paycheck. In the paycheck, they pay to Canadian Pension Plan, they pay to EI, right? It's a very simple working relationship where it's very obvious you're an employee. And you have to make sure that you are not in one of the categories where you're excluded. I actually worked with some people in a community food center in the city. Some of them happened to work in a greenhouse, doing workshops and other things. And the employer tried to say, oh, they're farm workers. They can't be unionized. Which is not something that they won. They lost that argument. But they tried because there are these exclusions. Same as with care workers, right? And so employers, they often will hire a firm of lawyers who will do the dirty work for them. But regardless, that's why you work with someone to figure out first, okay, let's make sure that everything makes sense. If not, how do we fight to make sure that we are found to be employees and that the type of work that we do is covered, right? And so, for example, whether or not someone's a manager is always a big question. Because employers will call anybody a manager. And sometimes there's so many managers that they're like, well, your union is only going to be 10 people because 40 of them are managers. But they're not. In the law, there's a definition of who's a manager, and it's usually somebody who can hire people, who can fire people, who can discipline, who decides on your vacation requests or things like that. And there's a lot of people who are really team leaders or who are shift supervisors, but they have the title of manager. So they'll try that too. And I've been in applications where they try it, it goes to the labor board is like, no, I've looked at the contract, this person's not a manager. So the employer will say many things, and the lawyers that they hire will say many things. They don't always end up being true. So this actually talks about managers. So step number 2 would be for you to talk to coworkers that you trust about getting unionized. You need everybody on board. So usually people are very careful to do this outside of work hours because you're not supposed to be doing union business during work hours. Of course it happens, right? Because that's when people talk to each other, is when they're doing work. But you want to limit discussions in the workplace to keep yourself safe from any sort of discipline to come from the employer. Now, they can't discipline you for union activity. That is against the law. But it doesn't mean that they won't try. Employers will try many things, like we just said, right? So it's important to keep it strategically discreet. So then you need to work with a union organizer to figure out all these things. This is where you would look at the different unions that you know, ACTRA, IATSE, CUPE, the Construction Workers Union, and decide which one makes sense for you. So for Dollarama, you might ask, okay, where is a union that already represents people in Dollaramas, or Walmarts, or similar contracts? Yeah, did you say UFCW? Yeah. So UFCW is an example. Were you a UFCW member?
I'm a steward.
A steward of UFCW. So UFCW represents a lot of private workplaces and retail workplaces. So that is an example of somebody who you might call. But ultimately, you can call several unions and have discussions with them and see who you think is the best fit for you. Yeah. Yeah, you can ask, okay, do you represent other people in this sector? Can I see some of the contracts of people who work here, right? You can do your research. And I do that with a lot of friends who want to do that. So let's go back to Dollarama. Let's say we have spoken to a union and they've said, yep, everything's looking good. Now we need to start the process. You need 40% of your workplace to sign union cards in order to become unionized. So that's why I was asking the size. And so your union organizer will work with you to be like, okay, who do you work with? And that's how you'll decide how many do you need in order to make your application. So this isn't a test, but can you tell us who you worked with at Dollarama? We're gonna try to write down everybody's name to illustrate this example. First name, if you don't remember, you can say, oh, the tall guy. Okay, so Guarda, Cristina, John. Okay, so you met with your organizer. Let's say you picked one of the unions that we talked about, and they're like, okay, we're being discreet, right? So we're not meeting by the workplace. We're meeting by the Tim Hortons close to your house. And you invited a couple of your close workmates that you trust. So you invited Connie to join because you're really tight with Connie at Dollarama. We're gonna add Connie here. And the organizer is like, okay, well, you need 40% in order for the labor board to be like, yes, you can have a union vote. who do you work with? And at the Tim Hortons, you would be writing this list with your union organizer. Then, of course, the next day, the organizer would ask you to take a picture of your schedule maybe, or have another way to figure out if you missed anybody. Because it's really key that you don't miss anybody. So for the first few days, you're building your list. This is number one. You can't go anywhere without your list. And so for those of you who work at St. Jamestown and other organizations with multiple sites, the hardest thing would be to build your list. Because people are coming in and out, there's multiple locations, there's people who only work from home, people who are street work, like outreach workers, right? And so you're not sure how many of them share one office, right? So this is actually the hard part of starting, because you don't always know who you work with. At a Dollarama, it's very obvious. But in other places, it might not be obvious. If it's a big enough warehouse, you don't know who works at night. You go home and there's hundreds of people coming in at night that you don't know about, right?
They need each other.
Exactly. So you have to find people that will help you make this, or you have to take pictures in the lunchroom of the schedules and things like that. If there's ever an email that's sent out to everybody, you're looking at their names, right? So building a list is number one, so that you know how much is 40%. So how many people work at this Dollarama? Okay, so let's say 15 people is the total, and everyone's double checked. We've looked at the schedules. We've worked a whole week, so we know there isn't a new person on the cash register. How much is 40% of 15?
6 people. 5.
5 or 6. I'm not doing it, so.
5. No, not 5. 5 point something. 6. 6. It's around it off.
5 point something or 6? Okay, so let's say 6. So let's say we need 6 out of 15. And then the organizer can work to put together an application to say, these people want to unionize. But then what happens is you work with a staff organizer, and I've done this in the past, is put together these applications. I write the list with the last names because now we've done our research, we found their names. We put an application together that describes the workplace. And in the application, we make sure that, okay, everyone's an employee, everyone's working currently, that kind of stuff. The employer then has the right to respond to the application, and they have to do that really quickly. And they send a list of employees to the labor board. That is how the labor board knows if you have 40%. And so then what happens? The employer sends a list where suddenly there's a Sarah, there's a Linda, there's a Coral, and there's 8 other people.
So you're not
There's 8 other people. And Nora tells me, Coral quit last month. Sarah is now a manager. Linda's on extended leave. This person isn't coming back. These 5 only worked last summer, right? But I wouldn't know that because I don't work there. So I do that work with you, and you tell me these people are not there. But the employer sent this list. So then what happens to your 40%? You have 6 out of 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 24. Now you have 6 out of 24.
That's not what.
You don't have 40%. Even though these are not technically employees, you can fight all of these names, but that takes months of submitting paperwork, maybe finding those people. And so the fastest way to get over that, and that employers do every single time, is you don't go in with 40, you go in with 60 or 70%. Because if you had, all of these people, and the only ones that you didn't get were these 3, even with the added numbers, you would still have 40%. But not just that, you're also, in order for every one of these people to sign a union card, you had to talk to them.
And if somebody decides at the last minute, I don't want to be in it.
Well, there still has to be a vote. So they can sign it and then decide they don't. But all you need at the beginning is to get people's cards signed. But in order for you to get Christina and John and Maria to sign a union card, you had to meet with them one-on-one. And you have to talk to them and say, hey, how are you feeling about work? And they're like, well, we could make more money. We make minimum wage at this Dollarama. Yeah, that's right. So we're trying to get unionized so we can make 20 an hour. That's going to be our request. And so what that means is not just that you get over this hurdle with the Ontario Labour Board, but that when you go in, you're majority organized. Everybody's pulling together because you've spoken to everybody, or at least 70-80%. If you can get everybody, you should and you have to, because you'll be strong when you start negotiations. Your bargaining team member in the room will tell you, if you're weak, the employer knows, and they'll push whatever down your throats in the agreement. But if you're all together, then they're scared that you're gonna go on strike. So 40% is the legal minimum, but you never go in with 40 for this reason, right? And so that's why the list is so important. Yeah, I think if we go down a bit. So, okay, another key part of this is, like Noor said, some of these people work morning and some of these people work evening. So let's say all these people are the morning shift, and these are all the evening shift, and these are all the lies of the employer. And let's say people trust Noor in the morning shift. So she was able to get these people signed up, no problem. She spoke to every one of them, but Connie is in the evening shift, and Connie's having a hard time getting people signed up in the PM shift. You've signed up all these people, but you're missing a whole bunch. You write a list, and you track, okay, who has signed a union card? Warda has, Christina, Noor, John, Maria. But in the evening shift, Connie has signed it, and Anna has signed it. But that's it. Oh, and Mike. So that means we're missing a whole bunch of people. Why and how do we get to them? And this is the part that is relatable to your tenant organizing, to your workplace organizing, now that you're still unionized, is you have these people covered. They talk to Noor, they trust Noor. But Connie was having a hard time with these folks. So maybe there's someone here who they also trust, who you need. Because you're having a hard time getting everybody signed up. So maybe it's Mohammed. Maybe it's Daniel. But you all know everybody. So you sit down, you talk to each other like, okay, who talks to who? Who hangs out with who? Who rides to work together? Who is the person that they go to with questions? Maybe Mohammed has been there for 6 years, and so he knows a lot, and people go to him and they trust him. This is how you can see where you're missing, where you're not organized. And that is something that you can do in your workplaces, if you're organized or not, is you write the names of everybody and you assess if they're with you or not by tracking things that you've asked them to do, or just by talking to them and saying, hey, we're thinking about doing this action. Are you down? Yes. If not, we have a problem. But then that allows you to put your energy where you're weak instead of where you're strong, which is what unions do. And this is our death as a union, as an organization. We go back to everybody who comes to the meetings, right? Everybody comes to the bargaining team updates. It's always the same people. These people are not in your meetings, right? You're missing them. And that allows you to use the very limited energy that you have, because you have children at home, you have jobs to do, you have things to do, in the places where you're the weakest, right? And then you figure out, okay, we need to talk to Mohammed. He's the guy who everybody trusts, and he's the one who will get these cards signed. And then that's it. You don't have to go talk to everybody, you have to go talk to him. You set up...
Wouldn't he get the phone number and start talking to them on...
Yeah.
If they can meet up, so that's like make phone calls and talk to them to each
right.
individual one and saying A, B, and C.
You have to figure out why Mohammed hasn't signed. Maybe he doesn't know about it. Or maybe he has questions. So you set up a meeting with him after work. You say, hey, this is what we're doing. What do you think? And if he is really the leader, the person that others go to, he will have questions. Because leaders are often people who are critical. They want to understand what's happening.
In order to explain it to the others.
Yeah. They're going to say, well, my people are going to ask me this. And you can say, okay. and you respond to their questions, but you're ready. You know who you're going to recruit, and you'll see things change once you recruit the right people. And so you know that you have to go talk to him prepared. So you talk to a union organizer and you say, hey, I think we're protected in Ontario against punishment for becoming unionized, but I don't know how to talk about it. Help me. Oh, okay, well, this is the law that protects you. This is what happens. This is what the law says. And then you go in ready. And you say, Mohammed, I know you're scared, but in order for this to happen, we need 60% of people to be on board, which means you're not alone. You have a majority of the workplace signed up, which means they can't pick one of you or two of you and kick you out.
They tried it, but
they try it.
but they didn't do it.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, they do. We all read the news, and in the United States, they're pushing back hard, and in Canada as well, workers that are trying to get unionized. And you can say to him, listen, everybody signed up in the morning shift. Often what happens when you're missing an important chunk of people is they all talk to each other and nobody's talked to them in a way that's convincing, right? And that is often language groups. So I've done campaigns in big workplaces where everybody who spoke Spanish had not signed, because the people that they were talking to, their leaders, and that conversation had not happened. And that's how you know, hey, we're missing all of these people. So somebody needs to go talk to them, and preferably somebody who can speak Spanish, or somebody who can come, yeah? And then they can ask the questions and bring up those fears. And something that I've found working with newcomers is that a lot of people have experience doing this back home too, even though they're scared. But you know, some of us come from places where doing this stuff is also really, really dangerous, including myself. And so that's a conversation that we need to know how to have. And we need to say, hey, I come from a country where people get killed for union drives. Here, that doesn't happen. Not to say that it's not scary, and not to say that people, you know, shouldn't be scared for their jobs, because that's your livelihood.
Yeah, I mean, union organizing is not nearly as dangerous here as it is in other countries. So that's one thing we can say for it. The law has generally in Ontario been in the favor of any worker who's been forming a union and was fired for it, because it does happen on occasion. But often you have a track record that you've been working with a union, and so they're able to build a case and show I was let go for wrong reasons, right? So to wrap this up, you have organized the majority of your workplace to sign union cards, and then you can work with your organizer to put together the application that goes to the labor board. If you meet the 40% threshold, which you should if you are putting in, you know, a majority of your workforce, then the labor board will say, okay, you have more than 40%. I believe that this is a real application. People want to unionize, and they'll order a vote. And that's the union vote that we've all heard of, maybe, that we see in movies. It's a secret ballot. It was often done in person in the workplace, but now they're online a lot, since the pandemic especially. And it's a secret vote. And just like the union cards, it's confidential. If you sign a union card, your organizer's not allowed to tell anybody else that you did it. And the vote, nobody sees it. Even Noor, who organized the whole drive, wouldn't see the votes. The union doesn't organize the vote, and your employer doesn't organize the vote. It's the labor board, so the Ontario government, who organizes the vote. So you'd get a way to vote either online or in person that's secret and anonymous. And then if a majority of you vote yes, then you become certified as a union. So there it's not 40%, there's 50% plus one of whoever shows up to vote. And then you pick a team, and your team starts negotiating. And in your team, I think you would want somebody from the morning shift, somebody from the evening shift, somebody who works cash, somebody who works on the floor, somebody who does restocking, and anybody else who's in the workplace. You want to have the representation that you've seen. And if there's big groups of people who speak one language and all communicate to each other, or some communicate to each other, you want to make sure that they have somebody on the team, because that ensures that people can have their ideas heard at the table. And similarly for age groups, nationality groups, job titles, right? Sometimes there's a lot of young workers who come in for the summer and everybody else, and they don't
hang out with each other, they don't talk to each other. You want them to have somebody on the table to have their voice, right? And so, but now that you've done all that mapping and you've recognized all the groups of workers that you have, you can do that. And you can say, hey, I know you probably don't want to, I know you're busy, but somebody from, the summer workers should be there. You guys should have a voice. So you all talk amongst each other and think about who you want to have on your bargaining team. But people will understand it. They'll say, yeah, actually, I don't trust you all to have my interests at the table, so we want to have someone there, right? And so that's one way that you can improve the results of your negotiations, is by going back and making sure everything is reflected, which doesn't happen often. Any of you who will be unionized, you'll know that your team was elected, you don't know when it happened, right? Whereas when you're forming a union from scratch, you're often the most organized that you'll ever be. So that's why it's important not to let it all slowly fall apart, but to stay having these structures created, right? And have people representing different groups of folks who are in your workplace. So when your bargaining team is elected, then you start negotiating for your new contract, which will lay out everything, right? Anything from what happens if you get injured, to your hours, to your salary. And then once the team comes to a version that they think is good enough of that contract, they present that to all of you in Dollarama, and you all get to vote on it. So that's another moment where everybody can look it over and say, no, it's not good enough. We wanted 20, we only got, 17. We're gonna send it back. And they vote it down, and that happens. It's not great, but it happens, right? So that's how all of you got your first collective agreement, those of you who are unionized. That's how you all got your first contract, was through this process. And then every 3 years, you get to renegotiate it. So you get to push for improvements onto what you already have, like our bargaining team member in the room here. I mean, like we've talked about before, unions are imperfect human organizations. And so even though you have a lot of power when you're unionized, it doesn't always take everybody into account, because maybe there was a group that we left out, right? We don't know how people are doing in the night shift because nobody's talking to them. And so when you go to negotiations, you don't get any improvements for them because you're not talking to them. And so it's a very imperfect system in that way. That has happened a lot for women workers, for racialized workers, for immigrant workers, where because they spoke another language, or because people thought that they weren't interested, or people thought that they were afraid to be engaged, they weren't being consulted. Women workers are often in like casual temporary positions, right? And so often those people are not represented as well as full-timers. So that happens all the time, right? It's our responsibility as union members to make sure that every group is accounted for and represented in the way that we do things, including when you renegotiate your contract, but also anything else. I would say on that note, remember, unions are you. Your union is your own, and you should make use of the organization that is there, built by your predecessors. Somebody went through that for your workplace to be unionized. And as frustrating as unions can be, just like every other organization, there are also structures that you can use, right? There are positions that you can run for. There are leaders who took a role in the bargaining team or as a steward because they want to learn, they want to fight. And for the most part, those folks want to help, right? And so make use of that and try to learn how to use the structure to protect yourselves as workers, because the enforcement part is the hard part. You can win everything you want at the table, but if you're not watching that it's actually getting done on the floor, it won't get done. They'll do whatever they want. They'll make people sign whatever they want. So talk to each other and use the power that you have that is there, because every union is imperfect, but you can make it, your workplace, you can make it better, how it works and how you can use it, right?
Thank you for this too.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also follow us on social media, and for more information, check out our website.